I want to help as many people as possible. And maybe I do that by getting out of the way and letting somebody else who is a better leader for that particular idea, that particular cause, step up and take the reins. I'm totally okay with that.
What's up, guys? Thanks for tuning into the Why Influence podcast, where we interview influencers about their why and their motivation for influencing. Today, our guest is Mark, who manages a bunch of communities, mostly in the podcasting space. I don't have a lot of stats because it's not as easy as going to his YouTube channel and getting the total views or subscribers. Some of his groups are private, so I can't even see how many people are in them. But I think it's safe to say that he has influence over tens of thousands of people spread between a handful of groups. Mark brings a unique perspective because the bulk of his influence is coming through the groups and the communities that he's building mostly from the ground up. Without giving any more spoilers, let's just jump into the interview. Until then, enjoy the beautiful intro music.
Welcome to the Why Influence podcast, where we deep dive into the why behind some of the world's most influential people. Why do you influence? Why are you an influencer? We hope to inspire you to share your voice with the world. And now, your host, Jeremy Siegel.
Mark, thanks so much for coming on the show. Before we jump into your why, I'd like to ask a few questions so our audience can learn a little bit more about you.
Yeah, sure. Shoot, Jeremy.
Can you tell us a little bit about your personal and professional background, what you did before starting your social media or, influence?
Sure. I was in the Navy. In fact, I was a nuke in the Navy for 6 years. I love that HBO series Chernobyl because I joined the nuke program less than a decade after the Chernobyl disaster. Watching that, it really hit home. After I left the Navy, I got my various degrees, undergrad in electrical engineering, an MBA at Emory University here in Atlanta. I worked at GE for over a decade, and I quit about 6 years ago, 2013. And I quit because they ended up firing my boss. They fired one of my coworkers. They made me cut 2/3 of my own team. They doubled my work scope. It changed my metric, but they gave me a 5% raise. So a year after that, all that happened. I'm like, I quit. A couple years before that, I co-founded a company that did business services for attorneys and their clients. And I was ramping that up. I think I had about 11 employees at the time that I quit my day job. And that's how I got my started of being an entrepreneur. I started podcasting about a year after that, or maybe around that same time. It's kind of hard to tell. It all blends together there. And really that was to put some credibility and authority to my stories, because as I was blogging about things, it was kind of hard to get the best stories without me quoting names of people and companies because they didn't want to go on record. But I was able to interview them, and you could hear in their voice that it was a genuine story. So that's kind of how I got my start, both professionally and personally.
Okay. And so most of your influence now is through groups, live events, speaking, that sort of thing?
I like to think so. Obviously, I've got a social media presence like many other people, though I will not consider myself a social media expert. And as we were talking before the show started, you've interviewed a lot of social media experts, and I can't wait to hear some of those interviews once your whole podcast series starts to go live. I'm not really a social media expert. I just interact with people on social media, but I deepen those connections through podcasts and videos and, of course, live events.
Okay. So before you started your podcast, let's go back to that point. Mm-hmm. What was your social presence like at that time, personally?
Pretty minimal, honestly, pretty minimal. I think I signed up for Twitter the month before I started my own podcast. And I was a guest on someone else's podcast before I started my own. So really, I wasn't involved in social media in a marketing sense before that. Okay. Most of my social media usage was just connecting with college friends or keeping up with family. I really didn't dive into social media marketing until I started podcasting, and it made it a good way. Social media was a good way for people to get back with me, and I could interact with the audience and kind of pull them into the shows.
Okay, so let's dive a little bit deeper into your why for that then. So what was your reason for starting this journey of sharing online and creating the podcast and going that route?
Honestly, SEO, search engine optimization. I started blogging, doing the typical content stuff that people said was important back in 2010 and still is, but I wanted more search traffic to my website. And I found that, doing these podcast interviews gave me more fodder for content, and going out in social media into the various groups where my ideal audience and ideal market existed, sharing the shows with them to get them back to listen and to read. It first started with SEO, and then I realized there was the, social media part of it, that it didn't have to be all SEO as far as traffic to your website.
So at that time, was it a conscious choice to become someone of influence, or were you just sort of looking straight up for SEO?
No, not at all. I was looking straight for SEO, and the tribe essentially started to follow, build and follow and listen to what I had to say after I was listening to them. So it wasn't so much that I set out to become an influencer and build my community. The community just kind of organically started to grow around me in the very beginning. And then that's when I understood the value of building communities and stepping out as a leader and an influencer. So then as I started other projects, I made that a priority first. Let me put a place for community together before I start to implement a new idea.
Okay, so that goes into what I was going to ask next, which is how your reasons have changed. So it sounds like your initial reason was SEO related to drive more traffic, and then it shifted more into this community. Do you mind going into some of the drives behind your community a little bit?
Yeah, really building these communities was a way to do a couple things. One was to deepen my connection with my audience and the community that I was already building through other channels. But the other piece was to listen. I wanted a place to where I could hear from my community of what resonated with them, what they agreed with, what they disagreed with, what their problems were, how they were solving some of their problems. So that's why essentially I built the communities. The big piece is the second piece, the listening, because I think in order to be an influencer, you have to listen to your community.
I like that. Yeah, I definitely see a trend so far from the people I've talked to that community is probably either the top or among the top highest priority for a lot of people. And if that doesn't start with that as the reason, it usually ends up there, which is pretty interesting how, that's the case for you as well.
Yeah, it's funny, the power of other people's words and listening. In fact, I want to quote John Marshall. He was an influential judge back in the early days of American history, and he said to listen well is as powerful of a means of influence as to talk well. And that's a lot coming from a judge, because obviously he influenced people's lives through his judgments and his interpretations of the law. But he said listening was as important to influence as talking. And that was 200 years ago, and that's still important today.
That's good, because I'm good at listening. I'm still working on the talking part, so at least I got some of that down.
Yeah, honestly, that's kind of how I evolved as far as like doing these live events and getting up on stage and speaking in front of large audiences that now aren't my community. It's safer when it's my own community. And as you know, I've built several communities around live events that I'll talk at, speak at, or just hang out and network at. And then once I get the invites to speak at larger events and conferences and getting paid to speak on stage in front of these big audiences that aren't necessarily there to see me, I just happen to be the person talking at that time. It can be a challenge, but I think the evolution of listening to others and understanding what is going through their mind makes it easier for me to talk to them.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So do you consider yourself an influencer? Like, if you think of yourself and who you are, do you think of yourself as someone who has influence?
Not really. I don't really think of myself in those terms. There are times when a lot of things happen and I have to step back and like, whoa, this is a lot because I'm an influencer. All these things happen because I lead these crowds, these tribes, these communities, and people listen to what I say. And because of that, others will reach out to me to get at my audience, understandably. And those are the times I have to think about that. Yes, I am an influencer to my audience, but I also have a commitment of quality to my audience and integrity to my audience. So I have to be careful with who I work with. And it seems like a lot of it happens in surges. Like I may get one a week, or I may get 3 a day of people, reaching out to me wanting to work with my audience. And when I get 3 a day, that can be a little exhausting, but definitely the point where like, wow, at what point did this happen? And why are they doing it? Because, well, as you mentioned, I'm an influencer of my own audience.
I think that's interesting. You started off saying no and you ended with a yes.
Yeah, my economist professor would always agree and disagree with various points. They would say, well, I disagree on this, but on the other hand, there is this. So it's funny how these PhD economists can essentially leverage lots of thought and math to both agree and disagree with a point. And sometimes I feel that I do the same. And you kind of have to do that when you're working with large audiences, because there's people on one side and people on the other. I'm certainly not saying take a stand for, something you disagree with, but there's lots of ways to do things and interpret things, as well as to start and implement. And you have to keep all those in mind. And sometimes as I'm speaking on these interviews, right? Jeremy, you and I are having a conversation, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a conversation. So these podcast interviews, you're not just up on stage talking to an audience. You and I are having a conversation back and forth, and I have to think about, the third person, the person that's listening right now, of, what they're kind of getting at. And sometimes I'll, may shift directions a little bit, but that happens in conversations.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, I think also part of it is, I think a lot of people don't like the term influencer. The meaning behind it has sort of been overused. But, the fact that you have these groups with these thousands of people that are part of them, and that you host these live events that, hundreds of people show up to, and you talk in front of audiences, I think that, as you talk more into that answer, you sort of shift the fact that you do have some influence. I mean, really anybody has influence. If you're thinking about, you can influence one person one-on-one when you talk with them. So it's just interesting to hear that dialogue.
Right. Yeah. And the reason I said no initially is influencer is almost a bad or negative term in my industry. And that's the podcasting industry. I work with a lot of people that have predominant podcasts that gets lots of traffic and downloads and large audiences. And oftentimes they get interview requests, guests will reach out to them, or potential guests, right? Will reach out to them and say, hey, I'm an influencer of such, and such. I know of at least a few podcast hosts, the moment they see influencer in like the first 5 words, it's almost a no.
Yeah. Okay. So when you started your journey of sharing online, did you have any personal or physical barriers to overcome to, start your podcast or start these groups? Like, was there anything that was stopping you from getting that started or getting into it or getting it to the level that you wanted?
Not starting. Starting was pretty easy, right? Because when you start something, let's be honest, no one is there. No one is listening. No one is reading your stuff. So starting, other than the technology, which technology gets easier and easier every day, there's really no barrier to stop. That being said, there was some, changes mentally that I had to go through as I started building an audience, thinking about, well, how vulnerable do I want to be? Do I want to make mistakes in front of this new and growing audience? Do I want to promote others, or do I not want to promote myself? So there's a lot of that mental evolution that happens as your community grows and evolves. And I didn't have a problem starting out because there was nobody there really to worry about. And I could just scrap it, right? If you build a community of a couple hundred people and you don't like where it's going and you've been too vulnerable, you could always just scrap that whole thing. But as it gets much bigger, you realize, well, there's a value in this large community. And I don't want to mess that up by presenting, a false image of myself or being too vulnerable or making mistakes. And it takes a while to realize that, honestly, that's why people are there. They want you to be the crash test dummy of whatever idea you built this community around. And the more personable you are about that, the more they trust you.
So since that's something that you've battled with as the vulnerability part, do you mind going into a little bit of maybe how you overcame that, or what you kind of mindset shifts you had to take to make it so you didn't care anymore? Or do you have any tips around that?
Yeah, it was my mentor a couple of years ago that basically told me and outlined all the reasons why she believed that I was a world-class leader in a particular topic. In this case, it was podcasting, as being a podcast guest and being interviewed. I didn't think of myself as a world-class leader and expert in that because I could think of so many people that were better than me. And she challenged me and said, well, are they better than you? And if so, what percentage of that among the entire world population would they be in? So maybe you're not in the 0.00001%, but the top percent easy, the top 0.01%, even doable. And the way that she outlined the world and where everyone is at and where I was at in my professional journey, that I was a world-class leader in that topic. And because of that, I had a duty to step out and say what I feel and teach others how to follow along.
I like that. Sounds like you got a lot of value from mentors through the process.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's a good tip to pick up too, is if you're working on something that maybe you're uncomfortable with, is to have someone who can be your champion to help push you through.
Definitely. Somebody who has been there before or have seen others go through the same transformation you're going through. It doesn't necessarily have to be a 100% match, because my mentor really didn't do podcasting. But she understood the journey and understood the transformation and was able to put it into terms that I was able to understand. And again, part of that was that fear, because I hadn't been at that level before. What's going to happen? Am I going to fall on my face? Is everyone going to laugh at me? It's the whole playground thing, right? If if I get out and lead, am I going to trip and fall on my face, and are my classmates going to yell at me? And I was feeling a little bit of that. And she put that to rest by basically outlining what I shared here today.
Awesome. So during this journey, it sounds like you've had several transformations, mental shifts happen from when you started to where you are today. So do you mind going into a little bit about how doing what you've done has changed you? If you think back to who you were before starting your podcast and starting your Twitter account to who you are today, do you mind going into a couple things that are different about you?
I'm much quicker to start a community and lead a community. And as you know, I lead several communities. So it's not just one big community and everything goes under that. As I have a little shift in one direction, I will create a community around that and see if it grows and what ideas become of that. So because of that, I am able to start these communities faster, find people, or invite people, and of course they invite others if it's a good community and starts to build and grow. And I ask questions and stir the pot. And it's a lot easier for me to do that because I do it with the idea of listening first and fostering the community second, and then influencing a far third.
Okay, so you sort of let these communities grow organically, and then you use your influence as just being the organizer to sort of shift it into the ways that you want it to grow.
No, I let it grow, and I ask myself, is this a community that I want to lead and influence? Quite honestly, there's been a couple of communities and Facebook groups that I had a great idea around. I started the group. I don't really steer the direction so much. I stir the pot a little bit with, some ideas and some themes and things like that. But as it goes in a particular direction, and if I'm going in a different direction, I don't try to pull the community over into my direction. I'll find somebody who would want to be a leader and influencer in this community and essentially hand it off to them. It's not because I want to build as many people around me as possible. I want to help as many people as possible. And maybe I do that by getting out of the way and letting somebody else who is a better leader for that particular idea, that particular cause, step up and take the reins. I'm totally okay with that.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, it's happened a couple of times, and I'm happy with the way that the communities have evolved. I'm happy with the leaders and influencers that have stepped up and taken charge of that. When communities are a couple thousand big, do I ever look back and say, hey, I wish I was a part of that? Initially, I used to think that as well, but I've also grown communities, large communities, and decided to take lead and influence those communities. And then realized later, I was like, wow, I really hate this kind of work. I don't like the direction that this is putting me professionally because I want to go in a different direction. And so now knowing that and knowing that, how big the world is and all the different things that people could do, I'm okay with letting what other people may see as a huge opportunity pass by me, or I start and foster and I want to hand off to somebody else because I know that there will be something else that's a better match for me.
Yeah, I like that. So do you mind diving a little bit deeper into that real quick? And
I'd love to.
What's like one or two communities that you have like a lot of passion for that you think that you're just going to stick with for a long time that you have right now?
Two come to mind. The Podcast Editors Club in Facebook. It's a community of about 4,000 editors that edit podcasts, and many of them are looking to do this or already doing this as a full-time profession. So that has become a really great place for not just sharing how to edit podcasts and how different tools and digital audio workstations work and different leveling plugins and EQ and all the really high-end stuff that honestly I don't know that much about, as well as like the business end of it, of how to get clients and how to keep the clients and how to serve the clients and how to increase your rates and those sorts of things. I really love that community because I think editors are a big piece in podcasting. I think a good editor that edits a podcast well, you won't even know that the editor was there. The conversation will flow. You'll have natural pauses. You'll hear people take a breath and sigh when it's relevant, those sorts of things, but that cut out a lot of the fluff, essentially. The other group that I'm running is the Podcast Guest Experts Facebook group. I run a few Facebook groups on podcasting in various topics. I'll choose like a laser focus and say, I want to do a group about studios, how to build, renovate, and rent studios and things like that. And I keep them focused. But the Editors Club and the Guest Experts group are a couple of my favorite. And the Guest Experts group is for guest experts and influencers that want to be featured on podcasts, as well as hosts that are looking to interview people on a certain topic.
Okay, great. Those are some amazing communities. I look forward to seeing those grow, and I'll probably try to join them myself.
Yeah. And that's not to say that like you and I met through Podcast Atlanta. That's not to say that I don't like that community. Right?
No.
That's a group of over 1,000 podcasters here in Atlanta, and we do live community events, sometimes these informal socials like you and I met at the other day, and more formal presentations and panels and things like that. I enjoy that, and it's always going to be fun for me, but I'm also right now in the point of handing that off and helping other leaders step up and take the reins and really drive that community. And that's tough, right? Because Podcast Atlanta is the world's fastest growing local podcast group. We're the second largest in the nation. Number one has been around for over 10 years, and Podcast Atlanta is about 3 years old. So it's tough to build something that is that successful. And then to say, I think the next phase of success for Podcast Atlanta would probably involve somebody else. And that's tough. It's tough to do that.
Yeah. So as far as these groups that you created that, people contact you, either a couple times a day or once a week, depending on the wave that's happening. Do you have a memorable story about someone who's contacted you through these means? Maybe you had an impact on someone.
Yeah, it actually came through a couple different groups because as you run different communities, people start to piece together, oh, hey, Mark Deal runs this, and Mark Deal also runs this, and wow, Mark Deal also does this other thing. Mark Deal seems to be everywhere. So I had somebody who's a podcast editor. They were starting out pretty early in their journey. They were essentially had one client. They were a member of, I think, a couple of my Facebook groups. They had been to one of my live events before, or maybe they saw me spoke at a conference. I forgot how it was that they first met me in person. Yeah, I think they saw me speak at a conference. And then they ended up editing an interview I did with their client. That was pretty cool. So they ended up reaching out to me directly and just asking me for a couple of tips of, hey, Mark, I know you've built these communities. I know you're pretty active in podcasting. What do you think about the business space and pricing and things like that? So I helped them out. Now that person runs their own podcasting group in their city. They just recently opened up their own podcast studio to record podcast interviews between hosts and co-hosts or hosts and guests. And of course has many, many clients that they edit for.
Wow.
So when I think of a memorable story, that's definitely one that sticks out. It was somebody that they were pretty early on in their journey. They were already editing podcasts, but how did they take it to the next level? And they wanted to have their own studio. They wanted to have their own meetup community. And, I helped them out with that. And now I look to them as leading certain ideas. And I don't want to give too much away and notice I haven't mentioned this person's name because once I do, everyone will be like, oh, I know who that is. So yeah, I should probably stop there, but they're now an inspiration to me.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think helping out the community is definitely inspirational even for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So you've been going through these communities and you've had ones that you either went a different path from or maybe lost motivation for, but let's talk about the ones that you're motivated by, that you're really enjoying working with. Have you ever struggled with motivation with those? And if so, can you share an example of when you struggled and how you pushed through it?
Yeah, certainly. I'm not going to be all altruistic on this. I do this for money, right? I like living indoors and my family likes to eat. But that being said, I'm also financially comfortable. So sometimes money isn't always the motivation, the driving force for me to implement this excellent idea that I had a couple of months ago. So yeah, I struggle with motivation as well. But how I get over it is I don't think about the idea I have it today. I think about where I would like it to be in 3 months to a year, map out qualitatively at a high level what that would mean, a couple of sentences, maybe quantitatively a couple of metrics, financial metrics and some leading indicators on what that would look like. And that will set the goals for me. But in order to keep up the motivation, I find getting stuff done makes you motivated. So it's not like you have to wait around to be motivated to get stuff done. Getting stuff done will get you motivated. And one of the things I do is every hour of every day, or at least, my working day, not when I'm with my family or sleeping, but every hour of every day, I write down what I'm doing. It's in a book. It's here on my desk. And every hour I write down what I've done. So that way, throughout the day and throughout the week and even the month and as things progress, I can look back and see, well, I've done this, I've done this, I've done this. And that also helps me identify things I'm not good at. For example, I could maybe do a little bit of graphic design, but I suck at it. I am really bad. It can take me 30 minutes to an hour to build a graphic for something that somebody else could do in a couple minutes. So that helps me identify where I'm wasting my time, where I need to hand a piece off to somebody else to let them do. So that's my big advice. You get motivated by doing stuff. Don't wait for motivation to do something.
I like that. So you get motivated by doing stuff. You're writing down what you did so that you can get motivated by looking at what you did. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of just a system that just keeps you going.
Yeah, it also helps me pace out. If I've got 5 things or 7 things or, gosh, I think at most 15 things. I try not to have 3 things a day that I need to get done because some of them can take a few hours and that will be a big day. And Monday through Friday to have a lot of big days can be exhausting for me. And I don't want to be exhausted for my family, in the evening. But having those, I need to do this, I need to do that. And then every hour logging what I've done also helps me pace. Am I on track to do what I need to do for today and for this week to accomplish my 3-month plan?
I like that. So speaking of your 3-month plan to a year plan, what's inspiring you most about the future? It could be anything that's maybe short term to long term. I'm just curious what's inspiring you most about what you're working on in the future.
Yeah. My kids and my family. I'm a family man. I actually quit my job, the story I shared earlier, right before my son started kindergarten. Okay. So when he started, and that was my oldest son, when he started kindergarten, I was basically on my own. And this summer, he starts middle school. So he starts 6th grade this summer. So it's throughout his entire elementary journey, I've been working for myself. So that is a big driving force of doing something that I love for people that I love in a way that is financially rewarding, yet flexible as far as, work time and commitment and when I do things versus when I don't do things. That's a big driving force.
Okay. And I know we haven't dived into it, and, you can tell me if you're not comfortable sharing if you want, but, we talked about these communities and some of the things that you're working on, but do you mind sharing maybe some of the sources of where income comes from in your world?
Sure. I direct branded podcasts. So essentially a company will hire me to do a podcast for them and their company. And as a podcast director, much like a TV director or movie director, I'm there behind the scenes, although live on the microphone, shouting things like, cut, let's back up again. I didn't get that. The camera didn't get it in this case, the microphone, although we'll do some live streaming events, but I'm really listening for the audience in mind. And some of those shows, I've actually been a voice or a co-host. So sometimes you will be able to hear my voice in those shows. Other times I'll cut it out. It makes it easy for my editors. Like, when Mark's talking, this all gets cut out, but he's giving me direction on what to do. That way I don't have to type in a bunch of notes for the editor. And of course, the writer does that in parallel while they're writing. So that's one source of income. The other big source of income is Podcast Guest Academy. It's a website I launched about a year ago where I help people find the best podcast for them and their message, how to reach out to podcast hosts in a way that will actually get them booked on those shows, how to perform the interviews well. And I think that's a key piece. There's lots of people that talk about how to get booked on interviews, but they don't talk about how to perform them well in a memorable and actionable way. And then, of course, how to leverage those interviews for your own book, brand, or business. And there's a few other things, like there's, speaking engagements, real estate. I own 5 rental homes that obviously will help pay some bills. So I'm fairly diversified. I've been around for a few years, but as far as like my primary active activities, it's directed branded podcasts and running Podcast Guest Academy.
Awesome. I appreciate you sharing that, because I'm sure a lot of listeners that are listening in are, hearing that you have this lifestyle, you have this family that you're supporting, and you're talking about these groups, but, until now it wasn't really clear how that was all coming together. So I appreciate you sharing that with us.
Yeah, certainly. And in fact, I know we haven't really mentioned a lot of names on the show, but it was Podcast Guest Academy came out from my Facebook group, which was Podcast Guest Experts. As I had this idea and I fostered this community, I thought, there's an idea to make some money here. And I started that Facebook group based off a talk. In fact, I think it was a panel that I was giving about how to conduct podcast interviews, because I have done those for a while, for myself and for other people and brands and companies. So I was asked to be on this panel. So I started this group to foster ideas and ask some questions and present some polls so I could be a strong panelist. And then the group grew from there. And then the idea for Podcast Guest Academy grew from there. So these groups could be sources of income for you once you decide that it's going in the direction that you yourself can fulfill and it's something that you want to do.
Awesome. Yeah, I appreciate that. So what's your favorite part about being a content creator? You've had a diverse range of tasks that you've done in your career. You own real estate and you do these other things. So content creation is sort of its own little niche in what you do. And just, what's your favorite part about that?
Right. Yeah. Content creation for me is all about podcasting. Some video live streaming, but essentially collaborative interviews, much like you and I are having right now, Jeremy. And it's a way not to just create content, but have a discussion with somebody else, such as yourself, and really discover something about the host and their audience, as well as yourself. Like, I've been doing podcast interviews for 6 years now, and you've asked me a couple questions that no one else has asked me before, which can be surprising because I do a lot of podcast interviews. So for me, I like content creation, especially through podcast interviews, because you discover something about yourself, but you also discover things about other audiences. And you, Jeremy, you're the advocate and influencer of your audience. So the way that you ask questions, and specifically the way you ask follow-up questions, it starts to tell me that this audience that you're building, they care about the follow-ups that you've asked, the tangents you've gone down. And then I have to think back on myself. Well, how can I resonate some of those follow-ups and various tangents that we've gone down in my own copy and my own content and things like that. So I like content creation specifically in the podcast interview space because I'm not doing it in a silo. It's a collaborative effort and it's something I really enjoy.
I like that. That's a unique perspective. I appreciate you sharing that because I definitely got something out of that.
Well, I kind of do it in a unique way.
So if you were to meet someone who wants to build a community, because that's something you've done a lot now, and they came to you for advice, what kind of advice would you give to someone who wants to start creating a community in whatever it is that they're trying to create a community in?
I would first tell them to, identify in 3 sentences or maybe boil that down to one sentence of what that idea really is. And then from there, come up and build a community, especially through Facebook groups. It's so easy just to create a Facebook group and give it a name. Don't go with something flashy. Go with something that you read the name, you understand exactly what it is. Put up your banner graphic and things like that. Start to invite the people that would like to be a part of that community. Get in, stir the pot a little bit, ask some questions, throw out some polls, and get people talking with each other. Find ways to reward people for contributing to the community. Welcome new members as they join that community. That's really how you go about doing it. Don't do it with the intent of influencing that community at first. Don't do it even with the intent of monetizing that community at first, because it may be something you don't want to monetize. I've built a large community once, and it was my first membership site about 3-4 years ago. I think maybe on the 3.5 year mark. Months confuse me. Years are easy. So it was about 3.5 years ago. I built my first membership site around a community I had built up, and they wanted a specific thing. So I built a specific thing, and I had a profitable launch. And it turns out I really didn't enjoy the work. So I let it run, actively for about 6 months. And then, of course, over the next 12 months, I had to, slowly shut it down, essentially by, shutting off new signups and then stop billing for the people that were billing regularly while continuing to give them access. And, after a few more months, just basically shut it all down. And that's not something I want to go through again, Jeremy. And that's why several times on the show, I've mentioned it's okay to come up with a great idea, a profitable idea, but it's not one that you want to fulfill and execute on to pass off to somebody else. I think maybe you could do a joint venture in a way that it will be profitable for you, or maybe you just gift it to somebody else. It really depends on the way you want to do it, but don't think just because you've built something and there's an opportunity for money to be there, that is the best use of your time.
Yeah, that's great advice. So let's shift that a little bit to someone who has more experience. Say someone has a Facebook group and it's starting to get established, it has some people in there and there's some dialogue going on. Do you have any tips or tricks to help them with getting higher engagement or helping to scale the group, or anything that you think would be useful to someone who's a little bit more established in that Facebook group?
Yeah, so a couple things I heard there, how to increase engagement and how to scale the group. As far as increasing engagement, you should welcome new members as they join. Perhaps a weekly post. Hey, let's welcome our new members. Tell us why you joined the group. And of course, tag everybody there. Facebook, as a group administrator, you have a great tool on how to do that. It essentially makes it easy for you. I just changed the copy around a little bit. And I like to add an image because images pop up a little bit more. But also think about ways that you can foster engagement. Some people do a daily theme, much like a Taco Tuesday. Maybe they have a Feedback Thursday, or in the editors group, a Fitching Friday. Basically, it's a way on Fridays we complain about the work that we do. and we have all these shoulders to cry on. That's one of our fun days. But you could also hold little contests, such as, look into your Facebook stats and see who is the top contributor and perhaps make them a featured member the next month. One of the things I'll do is I will send a couple of questions or a few questions out to them. I get them to record their audio to those questions. I create a little audiogram with their image and a WAV file that jumps up as they speak, and maybe the transcripts underneath. A good shareable image for a 2 to 3 minute video, but they're the featured member because they were the most highly contributing member. So that's all about engagement. As far as growth, make it easy. One of the things I like to do is I like to register a URL and point it to a Facebook group. So all the Facebook groups I manage, there's also a short vanity URL that I can easily share. So when I'm speaking, I don't have to tell somebody, oh, go to Facebook and search for this Facebook name, or I paste in a long Facebook group URL. I just have a short vanity URL that points directly to those Facebook groups. That makes it easy for
when you say point,
share.
It's a redirect, or it's a landing page with a link?
No, it's a redirect. It's a redirect. I certainly could do a landing page with a link and maybe even do an opt-in, like, hey, give me your email. I'll send you the link to it. But, right now, just do the redirect because I'm all about the growth inside the communities. But depending as a digital marketer, what your motivations are, you could certainly have a landing page with an opt-in, they give your name and email, and then you email them the link to the Facebook group. And then, perhaps you could follow up in emails on ways to engage and get the most out of the group. I like that idea. Jeremy, I'll attribute that to you. Good job, Jeremy. So that's one way of doing it. But also, other people invite like-minded folks to the group. So tell them how to do that. And I essentially tell them through the URL, because I really don't like when people add folks to my group, and I certainly don't add people to my group. I want people to request access. And you can ask up to 3 questions in a Facebook group when people request access. If people don't answer my input questions, I don't let them in. So when people get added to groups without their permission, obviously they don't answer the questions. And that's an easy way for me not to bother people by adding them to groups that they didn't request access for, that somebody else added them.
I like that. Yeah, that filters it out so you just get some quality users in there.
Right. It also, if you're a manager of a Facebook page, not your personal Facebook profile, but a Facebook pages give you some power over Facebook groups, especially when you join other Facebook groups. It's a power that, honestly, I don't want to give to anybody else. So I don't allow people managing a Facebook page to join my Facebook groups. They don't get the option to answer questions because they're a page, not a person. So that's another easy way for me to quickly delete requests from pages. I like people, not pages.
Well, Mark, I appreciate you coming on the show and sharing your why. I'd like to end the episode with giving you an opportunity to talk about your brand, your social accounts, your online course, and anything else you'd like to share with our audience.
Sure. I would like to share just one thing, and that is be a podcast guest. The person listening, if you're listening to this interview and you've got things that you'd like to share, whether it's on Jeremy's show or another podcast, and you've thought about being a podcast guest, I invite you to check out Podcast Guest Academy. That's over at podcastguestacademy.com, where we show you how to find podcasts, reach out, get booked, perform them well, and then leverage those podcasts for your own book, brand, or business, or just to have fun. And really, Jeremy, that's the only one thing I want to share, because one of the things we teach inside of Podcast Guest Academy is if you want somebody to do one thing, you tell them one thing. If you want them to do nothing, tell them multiple things. So sure, you can find me on, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and all these other communities I run. And I'll leave that up to you if you want to search for my name on those various social media platforms. But for one thing to share, it would be Podcast Guest Academy. Check it out.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because a lot of people that listen to this podcast may be struggling with being comfortable sharing themselves online, and video is a big barrier, standing on stage is a big barrier, and doing like a one-on-one conversation can be a little bit more comfortable, especially if it's not something that you have to edit after and do all the work of creating a podcast. You can just sort of sign up and be a guest on a show and test it out and see how you feel and how you perform, and use that as sort of a easy entry point into the space.
Right. There's also that third seat that's between us, Jeremy, the listener. So I don't know if they're active on Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter or Instagram or any of those other social media profiles. So even if I'm putting myself out there, perhaps they have a social media platform of choice that they prefer to use. So just whatever that is, search for me. I'm probably on there, and let's connect. Vice me listing off, oh, I'm on all these social media platforms because, hey, everyone's all these social media platforms. So that really doesn't make you stand out. Just point to your website or the one thing you want somebody to do.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, Mark, thanks so much for coming on the show and sharing your journey. I hope you have a great remainder of 2019, and I look forward to seeing your groups and influence keep on growing.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, Jeremy. I've really enjoyed it.
Well, that concludes this interview. I appreciate you sticking around till the end of the interview. Again, Mark, thanks for coming on the show. We really appreciate you coming on and sharing your why with some of your how. I wanted to go into some of the things that I thought were interesting during the interview, just to reiterate a few points. I thought it was interesting how his purpose started with doing SEO for his website, and then it shifted towards community. It's just keeps coming up. Every single interview I've done, the guest talks about community and how important community is. And here it is again coming up in this interview. I like how Mark made a comment about how important listening is, and it's just as important to listen well as it is to talk well. With my backgrounds, I'm definitely more versed in listening than talking, so it's good to know that I'm halfway there, and I'm using this podcast as my journey to talking better, and hopefully I can find some balance there. Mark talked about a few ways to stay motivated. Some of them included making a 3-month plan or a year plan. He said just getting stuff done makes me motivated to get more stuff done. Something that he does is he writes everything down that he does so that he has a book that tracks that, and he can outsource things that take him too long to do or things that he doesn't like to do. And also when he feels lack of motivation, he can reflect on that book and see things that he's done, and that can help get him motivated as well. Because Mark's expertise is a little bit more geared towards groups and communities such as Facebook groups, I tried to gear my questions towards that so we could try to get as much value for you guys as listeners as we could. He strongly suggests before creating a group to just come up with 2 to 3 sentences summarizing your group purpose. That way you have it well documented, you have a vision for where you want the group to go. Just create the group, invite people who you would like to be part of that community, and then just start engaging the group. You want to ask questions, do polls, reward people, welcome new members as they join. I thought all that was really great advice. I thought that Mark had some more value that could be shared there, so I tried to dig deeper and grab some more nuggets for you guys. Mark talked about how there's tools to welcome new members, so instead of welcoming each member as they join, as a group gets bigger, it's hard to do that. He said there's tools. You could create a weekly welcome post and tag all the new members in that post, and that's going to help with engagement and getting people to come in. And in that post, you can ask them why they joined the group and just spark some conversation. It sounds like creating some daily themes helps. He talked about the Fitching Friday he uses for the podcast's audio editors. They get to go on there and complain about their work and get shoulders to cry on, have other people to share in their dread of whatever it is that they're working on. And I thought it was interesting how Mark talked about holding contests in your Facebook groups to make your top contributors a featured member for the next month. I'm not very active in Facebook groups, and I think that it's interesting that you can motivate people just by featuring them as a member, but that's something that you can use that doesn't cost you any money to help you with getting more engagement or getting people to help you with moderating the group as it scales. And then a big thing is moderating the people who are joining the group. A big piece of advice he gave for that is to add questions. And if people don't answer those questions, just ignore those requests. You don't want your community to be full of a bunch of people that just joined and have no intention to be interactive. Something Mark said that I think is really deep knowledge in the Facebook group wisdom that he has is that a page cannot join a group and answer the questions. So if you're requiring people to answer questions to join your Facebook page group, I think I interpreted this correctly. Someone can correct me if I didn't. But it's my understanding that someone can't use a page to join your group if you require answering the questions, because a page can't answer questions when they're trying to join a group. Only people can. So if you require questions to be answered to join a group, then you're filtering out the pages. And you don't want the pages. You just want the actual people themselves. And I thought that that is probably something a lot of people don't know about. I think Mark did a great job in this interview. I think he shared a lot of value, and I definitely learned a lot talking with him today. When we were done with the interview, I asked Mark to give me some feedback or constructive criticism to see if there's anything that I could improve on. And he gave a couple pretty useful tips. One of them is he gave permission to feel free to dive in and pull names out of them. He doesn't want to take control of the podcast and, shout names out and push people in other directions if he doesn't have the permission to. And I felt like he didn't want to do it because maybe they wanted to feel confidential, but I didn't really pry at it to find that out. He said that I could have said something like, hey, let's be specific here. Can you share the name? Another thing he mentioned is if I want to ask a hard question or something that's pretty aggressive, I don't have to do it in first person. I can bring you guys as listeners in and sort of use you guys as the excuse. He gave an example such as, for the person listening right now, they're probably screaming at me, so I'm going to ask the question and then go deeper into whatever it is that you're trying to go into. So you can sort of blame the listener to make it easier for me as the interviewer to ask harder or deeper questions. I thought that was all some really good feedback, so I wanted to make sure I shared it with you guys. That's why it's valuable to stay to the end of the podcast, because you might get some extra tips and tricks that weren't talked about in the actual interview itself. But yeah, thanks again, Mark, for coming on the show. If you're new here, then please subscribe to the podcast. We have a lot of exciting influencers coming on the show, and they're going to be sharing their why and some of the how of how they do things. If you have been here for a while and you haven't left us an iTunes review yet, then please go to iTunes and just leave a review. Those reviews help us get bigger and better guests on the show. If you want to learn more about Mark and his courses or his social media presence or his groups, I'm going to be posting all that in the show notes on our website. So just go to whyinfluence.com, whyinfluence.com, and go to episode 10 with Mark, and you'll see all that information in the show notes. You'll have all the links to his groups, to his Twitter account, to his course. You'll be able to find everything about Mark that you want in the show notes. So just go there and check that out. And while you're on the site, you might as well scroll to the bottom and subscribe to the newsletter, because I'll be sending out some free stuff eventually. Right now, I'm not really using the newsletter, but as I get more people on there, I'll start sending out free stuff. And if you subscribe now, you'll be happy that you did. Anyway, I look forward to seeing you on the next episode. Thanks again for listening in.